I think Gary has brought back about three different people CDs. That previous Odysseys. I want to remind everybody, all the Odysseys are recorded, and they're on the desk, the library desk. You can check them out. Don't need to introduce Dale because he'll introduce himself and tell you a little bit about his life and his spiritual journey and so forth. So have at it, Dale.
Okay. My name is Dale Husband. I'm a dedicated Unitarian Universalist and have been since my early 20s. My religious journey has been a rather complicated one. I was born on May 8th, 1969, right here in Fort Worth, Texas. And I pretty much lived my whole life in the general area of Fort Worth and North Texas. My dad is James R. Bob Husband, and my mother is Dolores Husband. And I currently live with them in Haltom City, which is just outside Fort Worth. That's where I grew up. And so my lifestyle has been more or less conservative in terms of how I live. You know, I don't travel around very much. I don't, necessarily do very much, but I still have a very broad perspective on things. I was raised in a very traditionalist, conservative, Baptist-type household. So I basically grew up with all the Bible-based beliefs drilled into me by my parents and the church leaders and everything. But then, because of my natural intelligence and my curiosity about things, I became interested in science when I was about 8 or 9 years old. And so I became very interested in science. And I soon realized that my interest in science somewhat clashed with my religious upbringing. Because, obviously, I was in a religious community that took the Bible literally. And if you take the Bible literally, you can't believe in evolution. The idea that humans evolved from ape-like ancestors and so forth. We had some arguments about that, which, you know how it goes in a very Christian household. But then something came along which fired up my enthusiasm with science and also gave me my first hint that science could be compatible with spirituality. And that was Carl Sagan's Cosmos series, which was released in 1980. And it was very interesting because I considered Carl Sagan to be my childhood hero, my role model. And to this day, he pretty much is that. And he was... I would later find out many, many years later that he was actually Jewish. He was raised in a Jewish household, but he also considered himself an agnostic. It was really astonishing to me that Jews were supposed to be the chosen people of God, and yet so many Jews are also known to be atheist or agnostic. And Carl Sagan was one of those. And yet at the same time, he had a strong spiritual outlook which came abundantly clear in the way he narrated the Cosmos series and about how he had all this beautiful music for the series. And watching that series over a period of time fired up my enthusiasm for science. And that's the way it was for me until I was about the age of 15, when my mother started taking me with her to a small Baptist church that was only a few blocks from where we lived, Ridgecrest Baptist Church. And at that time, it had over 100 members, most of whom were fairly active, and even a thriving youth community of about a dozen members. So at the age of 15, I was enticed to become a born-again Christian. And so I became a highly active Baptist. I took the teachings very seriously, read the Bible front and back, thought I knew all about it and everything, taught Sunday school and all that. Almost forgot about my scientific background until I came across these books that were written by the so-called scientific creationists, which I thought, oh wow, so here's a way I could reconcile my interest in science with my religious beliefs. And so I started reading these books quite seriously. And then I went to college. I graduated from high school and I went to college at Tarrant County Junior College. And within a year of starting to attend college, as a result of being exposed to a wide variety of viewpoints I'd never even heard of before, I pretty much lost my Christian faith and switched over from being a Republican to being a Democrat. I went from Christianity to agnosticism in 1 year. And I began wondering if there was any truth to the religion I was preaching. The thing was, the creationist that I'd read seemed to indicate that you had to be a creationist in order to be a good Christian. And if creationism was debunked, then the credibility of Christianity itself would be brought into question. So when I actually came across a book that was written as a direct response to those creationists, and I think I still have it in my possession to this day, I read that book, and by the time I got to the end of that book, I'd completely deconverted. I was no longer a Christian. So,
You remember the name of that book?
it was called Science on Trial, The Case for Evolution. It was written by some biologist and professor. I don't remember his name right now. Oh, Douglas Futuyama. That was his name. This book was written in, I think, the early sometime in the mid-1980s, when the creation-evolution controversy was really going on a lot. Anyway, so once I finished my college education, I got into the workforce. I began looking for ways to make a living. But I also was looking for a new spiritual home. I no longer believed in Christianity, but I felt there had to be some sort of true religion out there. Was it Buddhism? Was it paganism? Was it whatever? So then I first came to First Jefferson Unitarian Universalist Church, and I started attending that as a means of exploring my spirituality while still trying to find a true religion. I still believed there had to be a true religion out there. I just had to find it. So for the next 7 years, I was a UU attending First Jefferson. Westside didn't exist yet. Or if it did exist, I didn't know anything about it. I think it was established around early 1990s or thereabout. Anyway. And I felt for some reason that Unitarian Universalism was empty of genuine spirituality, and I was wanting to find something more full of substance. And when I was living in North Richland Hills at that time, I discovered this community called the Baha'is, and the religion was called the Baha'i faith. And I began attending firesides in Bedford, Texas. Bedford, this up to the northeast. So I began attending these meetings called firesides. Firesides are meetings that often take place in people's homes where they teach the Baha'i faith to seekers, people who want to learn about it. So I spent 6 months attending firesides every Friday at this home, and they gave me a copy of a book designed to introduce people to the Baha'i faith, written by J.E. Esselman. It was called Baha'u'llah and the New Era. And so I took that book back with me to my apartment. I spent an entire month reading it. And by the time I was through reading it, I decided to become a Baha'i. So I went back and I told them I was going to declare my faith in Baha'u'llah, the prophet of the Baha'i faith, and I signed a declaration card. And that was it. I was now a member of the community. A few months after I became a Baha'i, I was elected to the local spiritual assembly of North Richland Hills, where I was living, of course. Local spiritual assemblies are like governing councils over a locality, because Baha'i faith has no professional clergy, but they do have elected councils on the local and the national level and even on the global level. So I was a member of this LSA, so to speak, for several years, and I was very tight with many of these Baha'is. And I almost forgot about the skepticism that my childhood mentor, Carl Sagan, had tried to teach me and the other people that had watched the Cosmos series and read his books and everything. But eventually, my natural intelligence and skepticism came back to the surface, and I finally realized after about 8 years that I had not subjected the Baha'i faith to the same level of scrutiny that I had once applied to Christianity. Because I was able to punch holes in the orthodox interpretation of Christianity, but I'd never bothered to try to do that to the Baha'i faith. It was my attachment to the people in the religious community that had made me attracted to the faith, not necessarily the faith itself. So in the summer of 2004, I actually disengaged myself from the Baha'i community, and I actually began to scrutinize the teachings of the faith with no double standards whatsoever, just taking the facts as I understood them. Within 6 months of me starting to do that, the credibility of the Baha'i faith fell completely apart, and I realized it was a cult. It was a dogmatic cult, the polar opposite of Unitarian Universalism, because in UUs, you are allowed to think freely for yourself. In the Baha'i faith, you can't do that. You have to believe what they tell you to believe, or else. And once I realized that, and once I realized their beliefs were not nearly as airtight as I'd previously thought they were, I resigned from the faith. I took my membership card and I mailed it back to them along with a letter denying faith in Baha'u'llah in January of 2005. And I got a letter back from them a few weeks later saying they had accepted my resignation, but they also wanted me to, they said they would welcome me back if I ever decided to return. Like that was ever going to happen. And the very first thing I did after I seceded from the Baha'i faith, I went straight back to the UUs. The previous time I was with the UUs, it was only because I was considered myself a seeker, and I really didn't anticipate being with them forever. When I returned in 2005, I was committed totally to being with them forever. No other religious group would do for me. And it was shortly after this that I met Sherry Day, the woman who would become my wife. And the circumstances behind my meeting her are a little complicated and outside the scope of this discussion. But suffice it to say, she came from a hardcore Baptist background similar to mine, Baptist and Republican and all that. So we identified with each other. And I thought I could give her a better life, so I brought her with me to First Jefferson UU Church, and we joined the church together. And then we got married. And after 5 years of marriage, we got divorced. And again, I won't get into that because, like I said, it's outside the scope of my spiritual odyssey, but it did inform my views on a lot of other things. So anyway. Sherry still goes to First Jefferson UU Church to this day, strangely enough. And that was one of the reasons why I started coming to Westside more often, because the tensions between Sherry and me made me want to avoid her, so I started coming here more often. Although I still am loyal to many of the people still in First Jefferson. So I go to both churches, sometimes here, sometimes there. Depends on my mood or what I can tolerate. Anyway, so I started a blog online around 2008, I believe, and it's titled Dale Husband's Intellectual Rants. It's an ironic title because a rant is supposed to be like you're screaming out loud in anger about something, and you can hardly do that while claiming to be intellectual. But I went with it, okay? I like the irony of that title, so that's the title it's always been. And I wrote a lot about things like evolution, politics, scientific issues like global warming, and religion. Dealing a lot with religion, promoting Unitarian Universalism, and also vehemently criticizing a lot of the dogmatic religious views that I had previously known and had to deal with, including the Baha'i faith. In fact, almost exactly 10 years ago to this day, 10 years ago, yeah, it was about 10 years ago, I actually wrote, I think, one of the most damning criticisms of the Baha'i faith ever. It's a blog entry called The Fatal Flaw of Baha'i Authority. And when I wrote that, in my judgment, that one blog entry was enough to discredit the Baha'i faith forever. Everything else I've ever written about the faith has been more or less commentary on that original point I made, to debunk the legitimacy of the Baha'i leadership. And that's been one of my main focuses of that blog, but not the only one. So when I rejoined Unitarian Universalism, and I realized there is no truth in religion, there's only community. And you need the religious ideals to help bind a community together. And once I realized that, I had to establish my own philosophy so I wouldn't be so easily swayed to join some community because of teachings that appealed to me. I invented a philosophy I call honorable skepticism, which combines the Klingon philosophy of honor as expressed in Star Trek The Next Generation and the liberal politics that seems to be so characteristic of the United States, at least some Americans, and my scientific interest and skeptical interest. So it combines skepticism, liberalism, and a strict hardcore view of being honorable and moral in your life. So you combine those three elements together, you get honorable skepticism, which has pretty much guided my vision of life ever since. So, in short, I am a liberal in politics, and indeed, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I actually regard the conservatism which so dominates the Republican Party today as being akin to what you would have found during the American Revolution amongst the Loyalists and the Redcoats, basically, as un-American as it gets. I don't understand. I just don't understand that sort of thing. So I'm a liberal in politics, hardcore. I am a Unitarian Universalist by membership, but by spiritual allegiance, I am a humanist and an agnostic. I don't consider myself a hardcore atheist because I've found from dealing with atheists that they can be just as dogmatic and arrogant in their views as some Christian fanatics. So I try to avoid that sort of extremism in any sense. But to some extent, I'm still looking for truth. And I've learned over and over again from my experience, you never can assume you found enough truth, because the moment you do that, you've already failed to find the truth, ironically. So that's the essence of my Odyssey.
That's great. I'm glad to hear that. At this time, we can have discussion and ask Dale questions to clarify anything.
Go around and just have people say their names first.
Well, that's a good idea.
I'm Gary.
And I'm Morris.
Jane.
William.
Cindy. Ann.
John.
There. Sharon. Judy.
Tony.
Hi, I'm Dale.
Adele.
Sound like young Sheldon.
Dale, say again what your philosophy of something skepticism.
Honorable skepticism.
Honorable skepticism. That's interesting to me.
Yeah, it's just the name I've invented for it. It's basically like secular humanism, but it has the attitude of the Klingons thrown in, basically, you know? If you're familiar with Star Trek The Next Generation, the Klingons, and Lieutenant Worf, the Klingon character in Starfleet, you sort of understand the Klingon. Is that the Klingon attitude is actually derived from the real-life example of the Japanese samurai warriors. They had a strict code of honor about them as well. So that's basically what what it really comes from. The real life equivalent of the Klingons of Star Trek is the Japanese samurai.
So that and Carl Sagan are your influences.
Right. Yes. Yes.
So you speak Klingon?
No, I don't. Sorry, I'm not that hardcore Trekkie. Nope.
How does your skepticism and hold up against, how does your skepticism and your practicalism, how does that hold up? How does that hold up? You do.
Well, in terms of truth, I believe that science is really the only genuine source of truth in terms of finding out things about the universe we all live in. Religion cannot do that, because what religion basically is stories that are told for the purpose of, binding a community together. All communities around the world have myths which define the culture. And I think what happened with the ancient Hebrews, the ancestors of modern Jews, is that sometime along the way, people mistakenly took these stories and started mistaking them for absolute truth, which they weren't really meant to be. I mean, it's like the lore of a video game like World of Warcraft, which can be very elaborate and detailed, but still fictional. Or the Harry Potter novels. Imagine if 1,000 years from now, there was a religion based on the Harry Potter books.
I'd be first in line.
So I really believe that, 4,000 years ago, you had these ancient people who had this mythology, and then somewhere along the way, they started thinking of this mythology as literally true, instead of just stories to entertain people and bind them together as a community, and that led to the birth of dogmatic religions.
Channel 13 ran an episode called First Civilizations. It was based on that very thing. It showed how religion was developed during the Egyptians as a means to keep communities cohesive and together. And that eventually evolved into gods, golden calves, whatever.
Yeah.
Many
Talking about a TV show?
Who?
Are you talking about a TV show?
Channel 13.
Yeah.
First Civilizations. You can probably go online and
And
get the podcast stuff.
in terms of absolute truth, if I was to take a position of absolute truth, I would indeed be a hardcore atheist. But I recognize that different people are attracted to different religious views and ideals and so forth. So recently, I invented a concept to explain this called spiritual orientation. Just as different people have different sexual orientations, some are gay, some are straight, most are cisgendered, and some are transgendered, and so forth. So different people have different spiritual orientations. A person may be brought up a Christian, but because his spiritual orientation is not Christian, like definitely in my case, he may leave it and decide to convert to Buddhism. Or a person may be raised a Hindu, and he may meet a Christian missionary in, somewhere in India or whatever, and he may decide to become a Christian because he finds the Christian teachings more appealing to him than the Hindu teachings he was brought up with. Or a person may even be brought up an atheist, and like the particularly notorious example of Madeleine Murray O'Hare's son, Bill Murray, who ended up becoming a Christian minister. And so his spiritual orientation definitely was not atheist. But I think that most people have a neutral spiritual orientation, and they do uncritically follow whatever religion they were raised in by their parents. But if your spiritual orientation is not neutral and it is different from the religion you were raised in, that's going to create conflict in most people's minds. And to relieve that conflict, they have to move to a different community. That's why I'm such a hardcore advocate for freedom of religion. I can't imagine what it's like to live in a place in Saudi Arabia where everybody is expected to be Muslim, or else. To me, that would literally be hell.
Can I?
Go ahead.
I have a question for you, myself, and everybody, basically. If you believe in spirituality, where does prayer come in? What's the value of it? are your prayers even answered? Who are you praying to? Can you consistently get them on the phone and get your prayers answered?
That is something that religious people have been arguing about for centuries. I think that prayer is pretty much what a person does to try to recenter and refocus his thoughts on an issue. Some people do generally believe in a God, and therefore they believe that when they're praying, they are talking to God. Non-theistic religions like Buddhism, however, have a concept of meditation, which is basically prayer without interacting with the deity. So I think that obviously for most UUs, they're inclined to engage in meditation rather than prayer, although I think both concepts are equally acceptable. Of course, I don't pray myself because I don't believe in a personal God, but I don't fault anybody for wanting to do that.
So what purpose does spirituality serve you if prayer is obsolete?
Because my idea of spirituality is seeing myself as connected with the rest of the universe, and thus being at one with all the rest of humanity and ultimately with the rest of reality.
So basically all you need is recognition.
You need to recognize your connection with the rest of the universe. I think too many people think of themselves as totally independent and autonomous entities. I mean, the most notorious example of this was the so-called philosophy of objectivism by Ayn Rand, who I think was one of the worst personalities of the 20th century. Definitely not a spiritual person at all. She was a hardcore cynic and basically made a cult out of being selfish.
Don't tell Paul Ryan that.
Spirituality does not allow for selfishness. Let me put it that way.
Dale, I'm excited that you're, we're excited about Carl Sagan. And I read a quote of his that's in the, actually in front of a book that I read. Anyway, he says that, science to him was like explaining the cosmos and the world around us in scientific ways, but it was more than just science, but it's almost a spiritual and mystical thing. There's so many unanswered questions and the quest and all of that points to a spiritual way of looking at life. And in this quote he says, one day we will establish a new, he says, religion based on it. Now he's not talking about religion as far as doctrines, and because he's very scientific, but a new spirituality based on it. I happen to think that is true. One thing that we miss in the UU Church and in humanism is this spiritual element. And instead of the worldview of the creation story of the Bible in Genesis, we need to transfer that to the scientific creation story of the universe and all the awe and the excitement of understanding the universe and the mystery. I think that would be a good place to cultivate a spirituality that would work for us today. And I think fit probably with a lot of your views. And Carl Sagan was really good at, bringing this forward.
I think the biggest problem with humanity in general, and Americans in particular, is that we have gotten so obsessed with acquiring more for ourselves at the expense of nature and at the expense of others in the world that it has slowly corrupted us to the point where we're pretty much like the Roman Empire was around AD 200, when the Roman Empire became so corrupt. Ironically, despite Christianity taking over the Roman Empire, it continued to decline until it collapsed into ruins and the barbarians took over. And I think if we don't drastically change our culture to the point where we recognize ourselves as human beings with other human beings and stop trying to rule the world and make ourselves rich off the world, eventually the barbarians are going to bring us down.
Chinese, I agree. I agree, exactly.
So what's next? What happens after this reality that we're experiencing? We're all here sitting having a conversation with you, but at some point this reality ends. What happens next in your point of view?
Well, I don't really know because I don't think anybody really knows. If you're talking about an afterlife, you know, I think we just are members of the human species, and even after individuals pass on, there are always more individuals coming up to continue. I think the so-called circle of life, as mentioned in the Lion King movie. I think if we stop expecting ourselves to live on forever and instead try to do everything we can in this life to make life better for others around us, that will be the true salvation we need.
I like what Eleanor Roosevelt and Willie Nelson both say, is that as absurd as this life is, it's not ridiculous to believe in reincarnation.
In fact, I actually invented a concept called radical reincarnation, which is not quite the same as the classic concept of Buddhism and Hinduism. It's basically the idea that we are all members of one soul, and that we have literally lived each other's lives somehow. That when you die, your soul is timeless and spaceless. So you could return in any other form. You could return as an insect. You could return as a dinosaur. You could return as Adolf Hitler. Who knows? You live literally every other person's life to some degree. I mean, in another life, I could have been Charles Manson. Who knows? The point is, we are all one in the universe. And if we don't recognize our oneness in the universe, we endanger ourselves.
What's the purpose of this life?
The purpose of your life is what you make it out to be, what you want it to be, and others respond to you in such a way that can either help you or hinder you in your life. You just have to figure out what is the best way to get along with others in your community. As long as you recognize you're in a community, you'll be okay.
I like what Viktor Frankl said about that. He says, you don't ask life what's the meaning of life. It's asking you what's the meaning of you. And of course, he survived Auschwitz, which is the worst conditions known to man.
Yeah.
There's the interesting case of Beethoven, who was brought up in a very dysfunctional family. His mother died when he was very, very young, and his father was alcoholic and abusive. His father was a singer in a choir, and he would force his son to take music lessons because he felt that was the best way for his son to make money someday, and so forth. And in spite of that horrific upbringing, Beethoven did become a successful musician, and he made some of the most iconic and beautiful music ever made. In spite of his upbringing, in spite of his very sour personality, in spite of the fact that he never got married, never had children, spent most of his life pretty more or less very unhappy, he was able to still rise up above that and become a great composer, and is remembered to this day for his music. And his life is an example of how you can overcome the worst circumstances and still make something of yourself. So to me, the meaning of life is to try to make the best of yourself and to make the best of the community that you live in, much like Beethoven did.
I'm fascinated with the fact that you were talking about him, and just speaking for myself, I get to the point that I think, what's it all about? Alfie. And I wonder, when I'm trying to pull myself out of that, I wonder how someone like Beethoven could pull himself out of that misery and that pain and write, this incredible music. I just think that has to be holy.
It's genetics.
Well, I guess that's debatable. to me is proof of a soul. That he could, in spite of everything, he did what he did.
So
Anything?
what I'm hearing, Dale, is now where you have evolved to is a place that you accept the UU principles as where you are religiously, spiritually, however you want to talk about it.
I would very much like to see UUism become a much more prevalent religion. And I think there's signs of that could happen, because as a result of conservative Christian churches like the one I was once brought up in becoming so identified with hardcore conservative Republican politics, millions of younger people, the so-called millennials, are abandoning church in groves. My own mother's church is an example of this. Remember I said that it had a thriving youth community. Well, that's gone now, okay? There are no youth at that church. The last time I visited her church, back in December of last year, there were only about maybe a dozen people there, and virtually all of them were elderly, my mother's age, okay? And the church was so poor that they couldn't even keep their sanctuary warm anymore. They had to congregate in a smaller room. So the church has pretty much fallen on a hard time, and I think that's true of a lot of other Christian churches. Young people aren't going to those churches anymore because they see those churches as shallow and hypocritical. But if we could somehow appeal to them, especially if these young people are already having children and are raising those children, if we can appeal to them on a spiritual basis, we can draw them in and maybe greatly expand UU membership. Instead of only about 200,000 members, we could have millions.
How do you compete with prosperity mega churches like Joel Osteen and all those?
By not lying to people, basically. Because I sincerely believe that the vast majority of the so-called Christian leaders are con artists, okay? Including, I think, Joel Osteen. It was so embarrassing, the recent scandal he had, in which he was discouraging people from coming to his church for a refuge when a hurricane was about to hit Houston. He said, "Don't come to this church, it's flooded." Turned out it was a lie. He simply didn't want people congregating there, you know, and when that was revealed, it damaged his reputation. I mean, I don't remember all the details, but I do know it was something irresponsible regarding that hurricane and how he reacted to it, which made a lot of people angry at him, you know. I mean, my analysis of the Bible and of religions in general means that there's simply not that much truth in it. The only clear source of truth is through science, and we need to judge everything from a scientific basis instead of taking anything we see or hear at face value.
How do you reconcile intelligent people, but yet they're members of these mega churches or these con artists? How do you reconcile intelligent people?
That's a question I've wrestled with my whole life.
Well, I already explained the concept I invented of spiritual orientation. Like if a person is raised in a Christian environment and their spiritual orientation fits that, then of course they're going to think that Christianity is the only path they can follow because they're inclined toward that. Whereas a person who's raised in that community whose spiritual orientation may not be like that may find a constant conflict in his mind dealing with it, and he may eventually leave it in order to find a path that better suits him. Such a person could come to Unitarian Universalism and find what he needs there.
I call those churches entertainment churches, and I think a lot of people go there just because they've got big choirs, orchestras, and put on a big show and don't demand a whole lot of the people except come and be entertained, and that's it.
My experience has been that people that go to those kind of churches is that they don't want to wrestle with any questions.
Yeah.
They want the answers. They want it in black and white, and that way they don't have to think. In fact, some someone I know, I was going to a Presbyterian church that was very open about questioning everything about the Bible. And that was even in the statement that we would put out.
Well, it's a cheap way to get a country club membership too.
And one of the things that the pastor's sister said about our church was, I really don't want to go on Sundays and question things. I want some answers, and I just want answers, and I don't want to think anymore. I've been thinking all week. So I think that's the thing that attracts a lot of people. So they don't want to think anymore.
Yeah, and I think to some degree, that was also true of the Germans in the late 1920s and early 1930s when the Nazis were on the rise. The Germans weren't necessarily evil people, but they were people who felt terribly wronged because of what happened at the end of World War I. Germany was brought down to ruin pretty much as a result of the Great Depression, and they were looking for a way to, let's say it, make Germany great again. Okay? So Hitler promised them that. And because Hitler promised them that, they were willing to put up with anything he inflicted on them in order to do it. They weren't necessarily evil, although Hitler certainly was. They were simply desperate to make themselves feel better about themselves. If you're in a religion which teaches you that God cared so much for you that he sent his son to die for you, that's an enormous boost to your self-esteem. Okay? So that's a good reason to cling to a religion because it makes you feel important.
Well, they work out of fear.
Yeah. Like you're the center of the universe, which also explains why the Catholic Church went nuts over what Copernicus and Galileo was teaching about the sun being the center of the universe rather than the earth. Because we literally want to believe because that we are the center of our own universe. And one of the things that science has done is it dethroned us from that. It said we're not the center of the universe. We're not a special creation of God. And if we're not careful, we're going to go extinct if we screw up. So it's a matter of humility, really.
I think William's your question was how can otherwise intelligent, rational people believe in, say, Christianity? Is that what you were asking?
Yeah, I'm looking for, the answer that I have for myself is that belief trumps intelligence every time.
Mhm.
That's my answer to that, to the
Say
question
that again.
that I posed to you.
Well,
My thought is that belief trumps intelligence every time. That's my answer to my question. I was curious about what
You know
your
what my
thought was.
answer to your question
What is
is? It's those people that are in power that do that haven't experienced real people in other societies. They haven't been at the bottom. They haven't mingled. They have and I've also heard this theory. There's two types of people in the world. There's believers and there's thinkers. And I was raised exactly like he was. By the time I was 13, I saw all these contradictions in the Bible. First of all, right off the bat in Genesis, Cain took a wife. Well, where does wife come from?
Yeah.
And it just goes on and on and on.
So I was a Southern Baptist for 5 years because I didn't know any better. I was raised to believe what my parents and my church elders taught me. And I was a Baha'i for 8 years because I wanted to find a community of people that I thought were like myself that I could belong with. Well, I was wrong on both occasions. That doesn't mean that I was a bad person, but that did mean that I was ignorant. But because I was still relatively open-minded, once I was exposed to the truth, I was able to accept it and move on. You know, different people have different spiritual needs. Like I said, it's the concept of spiritual orientation. If you're raised in a religion and it fits your spiritual orientation, you will be a hardcore Christian or Muslim or whatever.
For a while,
Yeah. Anyway, so if it doesn't fit, you may be tempted to move on to another faith. So I don't think we can necessarily dismiss all religious people as stupid, because I wasn't stupid, but I was ignorant. I'll grant you that much. So ignorance and stupidity are not the same thing. You can cure ignorance. You can't cure stupidity.
It's to the bone, as they say.
Yeah.
Well, there's something I said, I was listening to one of the conservative person, who's the White House press secretary? You might Sanders.
Today or yesterday?
Her father, I think it was his name.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, her father.
Oh.
One of the things he said, which I think was kind of brilliant from his perspective, is this. He was making a point about something that I think was just outrageous, okay? But he said, it is the truth because I believe it's the truth. In other words, there's no distinction between what's real and what people believe as it relates to what's true.
They don't worry about facts too much.
Yeah,
Well, it's important to really try to understand. I think they're stupid, okay? I get it, okay? But beyond that, I think it's important to try to understand from their perspective where they're coming from. The best way, you ever seen the movie Blade Runner, right?
no, I haven't.
Oh, wait a minute. Oh, God, I can't believe it. Okay, Star Trek, okay? Okay. But the best way to understand anyone is to see the world from their perspective. And from there, then you can have a conversation.
Right.
with them.
Walk a mile in my
Otherwise, you're just talking-
shoes.
Huh?
Walk a mile in my shoes.
Yes. I think which is the cure for the craziness that's going on today.
Yeah.
With the things that people like immigration, if if a person who was an immigrant experienced what an immigration would immigrant has to go through, they would have a different perspective from instead of
But
deporting.
here's what we all have to fight, including myself every day. We're all born with some part of tribalism in us.
Okay.
Family, faith, free, all that stuff. Hey, my family's dysfunctional. I just soon get rid of some of them as I would some of my enemies, Tribalism is something we all have to work on.
I think it's a human.
And I guarantee you, everybody's got some racism in them too. And I was raised as a racist, and it took me a black man saving my ass before I changed that attitude.
My case in point.
Yeah.
You at some point were exposed to what's on the other side, and from then you have a change of course. If that incident didn't happen, you may not have a different perspective.
I'll give you a good example. My car broke down on 28th Street Bridge, prime time traffic in the stockyard. I was getting the fingers shot at me, cars honking. A Brethren Church of Christ came by. So, oh, Tony, you got a vapor life. We'll see you. Good luck. Here comes this black man, a hog farmer, in a pickup, gets out, stops traffic, pulls the chain to my car, tows me to the end of the deal. And he said, what's your problem, buddy? I said, I think I got a vapor lock made me out of gas, and he gave me some money. And at this time, I used the N-word a lot. I was raised that way. It's the way we all were in the South. And I thought, this guy, I've never met him before. And he was 40 years older than me. I said, what? And he got me $1, which is like $10 now. This is in the 60s. What can I do for you? He said, pass it on, brother. So things like that can be altering, but most white people don't want to get out of the circle of comfort.
I think to some degree.
I had dinner eating with grandmas and dating their sisters, so I know a thing or two about that.
I think to some degree we have deluded ourselves into thinking that everything is going to be hunky-dory if we just let everything go. We went through the civil rights struggles of the 1960s, and then after that, most white people thought that everything was going to be fine after that. Well, it wasn't, because then Richard Nixon became president, and when Nixon was president, before that, he pioneered the Southern strategy of corrupting the Republican Party by making it appeal to the former Democrats in the South who had been racist. They left the Democratic Party and came to the Republicans. Nixon also pioneered the drug wars, which was basically an attempt at social engineering by attacking people of color and the poor who were trying to get themselves out of poverty by dealing drugs. If you truly believe in a free market economy, you do not support the drug war, okay? I mean, there are ways you can combat drug abuse without throwing millions of people in prison for decades. You know, that's,
I
anyway.
agree.
But anyway, so we let go of the wheel, and because we thought everything would be fine. Nixon took over. He corrupted the Republican Party a little bit. Then Reagan became president in the 1980s. He made things worse. Then Bush Jr. became president in the 2000s. He made things a lot worse. Every one of those.
I'm sorry, we need to stop, because people need to come into the.
Okay. My point is, every one of those Republican presidents paved the way for the next one to become even worse. And with Donald Trump, we have hit rock